I am Dr. Andrew Wiest. I teach history and pubology here at the University of Southern Mississippi. How about you, Dr. whoever you are?
I'm Dr. Kevin Greene. I teach history too, and I'm a big fan of pubs and an experienced field researcher for British pubs.
And we thought maybe one thing we could do today is kind of tell you something about the history of the pub, where it came from. Pubs have a extremely ancient history. The first pubs, although they weren't called pubs, were actually founded by the Romans. When the Romans came over to Britain, they brought with them what they did in the rest of the world, which is great organization. The Romans, the reason they were able to rule over places for so long, because they were just, again, crackerjack at organizing stuff. And maybe the chief thing they did was build roads. Nice straight ones, and if in Britain you go down a road and it's straight, it's because the Romans built it and the British just stole it later. And it was by law in the Roman countryside that you had to have a watering hole every 15 miles, especially for the army. But for Romans traversing the roads and trading, they called them tabernas, which was eventually changed to tavern. And for the Romans to actually have the place work, it had to have a sign outside of it that had grapes on it, which was to indicate that it had wine. And so the earliest watering holes in Britain date back to the Romans. If you know your British history, the Romans lost control of that place. So the Saxons took them over. The Saxons added greenery to the signs because they're kind of evergreen kind of people. So greenery was added. Then the Saxons got whipped by the Vikings. The Vikings added a pole. So the sign now had to be on a pole, because the pole was also used to stir ale to help it ferment. So those were the original signage came from. The Vikings also added a peg. A peg was their unit of measurement of beer. And when you got too drunk, you were brought down a peg, is how the Vikings like to put it. So again, dates back to British history, British culture. The first real modern pubs that we would kind of recognize, inns and taverns became separated around the time of the Crusades. Taverns became less reputable. They were simply places to go get drunk and tie one on. Inns is where you went and spent the night. So taverns kind of went one way, pubs and inns went another. And the oldest continuing service in Britain is Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem, founded during the First Crusade. And it was where crusaders went to meet up with the king before they went and head off on crusade. So that's the oldest pub you can still go to, although technically it's still an inn, because pubs don't become pubs until the Tudors come along, Henry VII and Henry VIII. They did two really big things to pubs. First, they began to license them, so your first licensed pubs date back to the Tudor dynasty in the 14 and 1500s. And the big thing they did, Henry VIII, we'll see this in our class when we go over. Henry VIII had a little problem with the church. They didn't want him to be married to the people he wanted to be married to, so he was like, "You're out of here, church." Divorced and then beheaded some wives as well. But the big thing he did was undermine the Catholic Church in Britain, overthrew it. At this point, there were two things vying in Britain for your social time. One was the church, and the other one were these taverns and inns, now called pubs. He destroyed the church as a local gathering place, so where do you gather after that? And social life begins to switch over to pubs away from the church, because the church is gone. So this is when pubs just become massively popular. Ooh, I got some numbers for you. Again, I hate looking at my notes, but I will. The first census of pubs was taken in 1577, and there were 20,000 of them, was how important pubs had become. They become even more important when gin comes along, because gin is terrible. Gin rots you out and turns you into Jack the Ripper and fun stuff like that. The early Industrial Revolution in Britain. And pubs, pardon? Go for it.
Early 18th century, mid 18th century.
Yeah, Victorian times, yeah. And gin was so unhealthy that they began to, as America was looking at getting rid of alcohol, Britain began to worship at least beer, because it was a healthy alternative to gin. And the thing that really cements the pub in modern history is the invention of the railroad, because every railroad terminus needed a pub next to it. And It's where the term insider and outsider came from. An insider on a railroad had a ticket to sit inside the carriage. The outsider had to hang on the outside. And pubs didn't like outsiders, they liked insiders. So pubs developed a two-tier system in which richer people went to the saloon inside the pub and the outsiders hung around outside. And I should, I guess, do my pub poem. I threatened to bring a pub poem to you, and I did. Pubs became so big in this age of rail that they began to take everybody's money. And maybe the most famous pub of all was the Eagle on City Road in London. It still exists. And a little nursery rhyme came around because everybody went in there and lost their money. They say, up and down the city road, in and out the Eagle, that's where my money goes. Pop goes the weasel. The weasel was your money. It popped right out of your pocket and went into their pint buying facilities. So that's a little bit on the history. What can they expect of pubs today? Dr. Greene, tag, you're in.
So on the cultural side of pubs, they have a quite distinct function in British culture and British society. But in more simpler terms, if your favorite and beloved family member passes away, you go to the pub. If you get a new job or a promotion, you go to the pub. If you go out on a first date with someone, you can maybe grab a beer at the pub. If you have your first child, you celebrate at the pub. It's a place where Britons and folks in the UK create community and build ideas about what it means to live in urban spaces or even in rural spaces, but particularly in urban spaces, close to one another with lots of people. You don't always have the opportunity to form these types of close relationships. Pubs serve in that particular role. And every community has a favorite pub or a local pub or perhaps now a corporate pub, a big one that is owned by a chain across the UK that serves in a different kind of capacity, usually much larger, usually larger selection of beer, but not quite the quaint, older, established architecture of some of the earlier pubs. Pubs start to really change shape in the Victorian period, whereas before, in some cases, they would have been hard to identify from homes or inns or taverns. But as we get more and more into the 19th century, you start to see, especially as class differentiation within the Industrial Revolution changes how the pub operates, you start to see a nice central bar with ornate woodworking and nice glasswork that has that presents an aesthetic that's very attractive to growing bourgeois and upper class folks, while, as Dr. Wiest mentioned, the poor folks are sitting outside hanging out in the pubs out there. So it serves a different role than it does in the U.S. For example, bars in American culture are particularly a place where we go to consume alcohol. And that's your sort of sole purpose, is to perhaps have more than a few pints, to have perhaps half a dozen or maybe 10. It serves as that particular role, whereas restaurants that serve alcohol serve another particular role. We don't have quite the analog to the pub in the U.S. We are still, specifically in the South here, we rely heavily on churches in certain communities to develop community relationships. We also are involved, whether civically engaged or in other types of sports activities across communities. We look for those places in the U.S. to build relationships and create community. The pub serves as a central hub for that. So, for example, if your sports team wins the tournament, guess where you're going? You're going to the pub, right? If you have experienced a great sermon on a Sunday, well, guess where you're going to go after church? You're going to go to the pub, right? You're going to experience that. So it's a way to create community among Britons with a long standing history of drinking, particularly ale. That's their, and of course you can buy all types of international brews of beer in these spaces, but traditional English ale, they've been brewing this for a long time, which is fascinating in terms of the Roman history, because that's one of the stayovers of British culture. Even if the Romans were there, they continued to serve ale. A lot of the pubs these days are owned by large corporations and companies. There are what's known out in communities and rural countrysides as free houses, which are free of sort of that type of commercial control, and as such are free to experiment with different types of beer, to sell different kinds of beer, and they're not contracted or under a contractual obligation to sell larger corporate beer. So some of the free houses are even more traditional in the sense that they often offer local brews or special brews or limited edition brews, and these folks have really made an art and craft out of it in a way that just doesn't quite exist in the commercial pubs. So we hope that as you kind of participate in British pub culture, that you get a great taste, because as Dr. Wiest mentioned before, there are some that are extraordinarily old. There are some that are quite new and quite modern and 21st century, but all of them, no matter where they are or how they're sort of arranged aesthetically or how they're organized, serve a particular similar role in British society.
In Britain, it's also intertwined with something called club culture, where there's a specific club. I mean, they're referred to as gentlemen's clubs because they don't include women, at least at their inception. Of course, gentlemen's club in America carries an entirely different connotation, but the British would be aghast at the American connotations associated with that, which means that pubs tend to, in smaller villages, pubs include everybody, but in London, there's enough pubs out there for pubs to become associated with a certain political brand. There'll be liberals in one pub, and right around the corner there'll be, Labourite socialists in another, and around the corner there'll be conservatives, and you tend to gather in those pubs to run into people who are politically of like mind. If you really want to debate, get up out of your pub and go to the other one and run into the opposition. And so you certainly find, and pubs in London too become associated with various artistic types. If you go to Bloomsbury, you're going to run into the pubs there that were full of the Bloomsbury group writers of the early modernist movement. There's pubs specifically associated with actors in the West End. There's pubs specifically associated with the revolution. Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese communist revolutionary, learned his stuff in a London pub. It's now in kind of the deeper east side of London. So pubs are for organizational purposes as well as just go kind of have a good time purpose. And you kind of have to know the pub you're going to find those kinds of pubs today, because the homogenization of culture has resulted in homogeneity among pubs. But if you still know where you're going, you can find a Labour pub, you can find a Conservative pub, you can find the pub where you want to get into or really want to stay out of political debates with people. But that's one of the reasons that Dr. Greene and I like to go to pubs when we're over there. It's certainly great to hang out with Americans, but we get to do that all the time. Pubs, especially if you do your research on them, is where you're going to find British culture and British people, and they're going to talk to you about, because they all have misplaced preconceptions about what it is to be American. And when they run into an American who's not in like a fleet of Americans, that's difficult to get into. If they run into you in one or twos in pubs, they're going to ask you about what it is to be an American. They're going to ask you specifically about guns and national health, because they don't understand our lack of national health and our plethora of guns. They just don't get that. And so be ready in those environments, and when you're outside your group, to really get into a deep discussion, because the people in pubs will want to talk about those, won't they, Gavin?
They will, and they want to ask you about American political leaders and American political perspectives. They see us as relatives, and we made up over the 19th century, and we're friends again, and they're very curious of who we are and what we're up to.
And the pubs is a great place to go to disabuse yourself of the notion of British as a monolith, and it's a great way for them to disabuse themselves of the notion of America as a monolith too. And it's just fun to let them explore what being American is while you're getting to explore being British is.
Your experience in a pub will be vast and different depending on the type of pub you're in. Some of the larger pubs that are more reminiscent of beer halls, it will be loud and boisterous, and you will be one of many ordering from the bar and getting a basket of chips and having a good time. But perhaps at a more local pub, you might be in somebody's seat on a Thursday night, and they're wondering who you are and where you came from, and it will be much more of an intimate, quaint experience. But it's in those spaces where you really learn what the UK and British culture, pub culture particularly, but what it means to be a Briton, what they think it means to be an American. Talk about Ben and Ruby.
Yeah, when I was a student over there, went over as a 21-year-old. Right behind the campus we were in then was a pub called the Black Bull. And I was like, it's a pub. It's right there. Campus is here. 10 feet away is a pub. I know where I'm going to go. And so I walked into that pub, and there was couple who at that time was probably in their 30s, seemed magnificently old to a 21-year-old. But I walked in there, and the guy behind the bar is called the publican. He may or may not own it and run it. Often the publican lives upstairs, and they come downstairs and run it. Sometimes there'll be a bartender who he's hired there. But when I walked in, it was the publican. And by the way, you're not supposed to tip them. They get paid an adequate wage. If you love your publican, put him one in the well, which means pay for his drink later, because he's going to get off work and he's going to have a drink with you later if he gets off work early enough. So you don't tip, you order at the bar. There's not table service in most pubs. So I went up to the bar and didn't know what to do, and he came over, and of course there's beer taps everywhere and all different kinds of things being sold. He says, "What do you want?" And I said, "A beer." And a person next to me starts laughing, because they hadn't seen Americans in this pub for, I was like the first one in a long time. And so they gave me hints on what I should do. That's not how you order a beer, yank. And it turns out this was, I wound up meeting a person there that I still know. When I go to visit Britain, I visit them. They now no longer live in London. They've moved out of town. I lived with them twice. I kind of became their American adoptive son. They came to America to visit us. It's a couple named Ben and Ruby Buckle, and they introduced me to English sports because they were big Chelsea fans. So I had to wear the flag and learn the cheers. You better know the flag and you better know the cheers if you're in a sports pub on the right Saturday.
And like political persuasions, every pub has a team.
Oh yes, and you better be for the right team. If you're for the wrong team, just kind of head out and go to a different team's pub. And so they were my introduction to British pub culture, and we still correspond. I'll see them this summer when I go, and I met them in 1981. So you can make very long-lasting relationships with the people you run into in these pubs, because they're there for the right reason. They're there to socialize. They're there to be friendly, and if you're there for that reason too, they'll welcome you with open arms.